It started as a simple plan to get away from everything, to spend a few days in the woods where there were no phones, no emails, no people, no obligations. I had found a small cabin online, tucked deep in a forested area far from any town or road. The pictures were rustic but charming, with a stone chimney, a small porch, and a surrounding of dense pine and oak trees. The owner had assured me that it was isolated, quiet, and the perfect place to recharge. I had been living in the city for too long, constantly surrounded by noise, traffic, and people. I needed silence, the kind that pressed against your ears and made you feel your own heartbeat. I packed my bag with clothes, food, water, a first aid kit, and a few books, thinking I would spend my nights reading by the fire. I brought a flashlight, some candles, and a small lantern just in case. The drive to the cabin was long. The road narrowed as I got deeper into the forest. At first, it was paved, but eventually it turned into gravel and dirt, potholes and ruts, making me slow down. The sunlight filtered through the trees in thin beams, illuminating dust in the air. It smelled like pine, wet earth, and leaves decaying. I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. By the time I turned onto the last stretch of path, a narrow dirt track barely wide enough for my car, I realized how completely alone I would be. The trees pressed against the road from both sides, thick and dark, blocking any view of the sky. There were no other cars, no signs of life except the occasional bird or squirrel. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked on a small clearing and stepped out. The air was colder than I expected, even though it was late morning. The cabin was exactly as the pictures had shown. A small stack of firewood sat against the wall near the porch, and smoke from the chimney suggested someone had been there recently. The door creaked as I opened it, and inside the cabin smelled of wood, dust, and something faintly musty, like old blankets. The interior was simple. A small kitchen area with a sink, a wood stove, a table with a couple of chairs, and a sleeping area with a single bed. I set my bag down and began to explore, making sure everything was in working order. I built a small fire in the stove, using the dry kindling I found stacked neatly nearby. The crackling warmth filled the cabin and made it feel a little more like home. I took off my shoes, stretched, and sat at the table with a cup of coffee I had brought. The forest outside was quiet, almost eerily so. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, but no animals, no rustling, nothing that suggested life beyond me. At first, it was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. I unpacked my things, organized the small kitchen area, and decided to take a walk around the property before it got dark. The clearing around the cabin was larger than I had realized, but the trees quickly closed in beyond the edges. I walked the perimeter slowly, noticing the thick layer of leaves and pine needles underfoot. The forest felt dense, like it was swallowing me. I found a small creek a little further out, its water moving quietly over rocks, clear and cold. I knelt and drank a little, tasting the fresh, clean water. I marked the locations of the creek and the clearing in my mind, in case I needed to remember them later. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin and prepared a small meal. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the forest floor, and the light inside the cabin dimmed quickly. I lit candles and set them around the room, giving a soft glow to the interior. That night, I slept fitfully, waking several times to strange noises outside. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, and a low, constant creaking that sounded almost like someone walking in the distance. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, the forest settling, but a part of me remained tense, listening for anything unusual. The next morning, I woke early and made a fire in the stove. The sun barely reached through the trees, leaving the forest in dim light. I had a plan to hike a little deeper into the woods, to explore, but I wanted to stay close to the cabin. The first few hours were peaceful, the kind of solitude I had dreamed of. Birds chirped faintly, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. But as I moved further from the clearing, I began to notice small signs that something had been there recently. Footprints in the mud that weren't mine, broken branches at unusual angles, and piles of leaves disturbed as if someone or something had walked through. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself the forest was full of animals. But the prints didn't look like any animal I knew. They were too large, uneven, and had a shape that suggested a heavy, human-like weight. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck and decided to head back to the cabin. The hike back was slow and tense. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound magnified. When I finally reached the clearing, I locked the cabin door behind me and checked the windows. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Over the next 2 days, my unease grew. I kept the fire going constantly, checking the perimeter repeatedly. Each time I walked outside, I noticed more signs. Deeper footprints leading toward the cabin, branches snapped close to the porch, small rocks moved slightly out of place. It became impossible to ignore. I felt like I wasn't alone. The forest that had felt peaceful before now seemed threatening, suffocating. At night, the noises grew louder, branches breaking, twigs snapping, the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving around the clearing. I slept in bursts, waking often to check the locks and listen. My imagination ran wild, picturing someone hiding just beyond the trees, waiting. On the third day, I realized I had to leave. I couldn't stay here another night, but the road back was treacherous. The narrow dirt path twisted through dense forest, and I had only been there once during daylight. I packed quickly, grabbing everything I had brought. I double-checked the cabin, making sure nothing was left behind. As I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A set of footprints leading from the edge of the clearing toward the cabin. They were fresh, and they didn't belong to me. Someone had been here while I was inside. I didn't hesitate. I ran to my car, the uneven ground making me stumble, but adrenaline carried me forward. I jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands shook so badly I had trouble controlling the wheel. I drove down the narrow path as fast as I could, keeping my eyes on the shadows moving between the trees. Every branch that cracked sounded like a warning, every rustle like someone following. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that the dirt road eventually led to the main road. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, I finally reached the paved road. The sense of relief was immediate. I slowed down, breathing heavily, still glancing over my shoulder. The city lights were faint in the distance, but they promised safety. I kept driving until I reached a gas station, where I stopped to calm myself and think. I realized that staying in the cabin, alone in the forest, had been far more dangerous than I had anticipated. The isolation had made me an easy target. I reported the incident to the local authorities, describing the cabin, the location, and the signs I had seen. They told me they would check it out, but I didn't wait for them. I needed safety immediately. Over the next few days, I stayed with a friend in the city, unable to shake the memory of the cabin, the forest, and the feeling of being watched. The authorities later confirmed my fears. There had been reports of trespassers and break-ins in the area. They found footprints and evidence of someone living temporarily in the woods near the cabin, someone who had likely been observing the property for weeks. They reinforced my sense of luck and relief that I had left when I did. Eventually, I was able to sleep again, though the memory lingered. I learned a harsh lesson about isolation, trust, and preparation. The forest could be beautiful and peaceful, but it could also be dangerous, especially when someone else was watching. The cabin, which had seemed like a perfect escape, became a place I could never return to. I realized that solitude carries risks that aren't always obvious, and that human threats can be far scarier than any imagined fear. In the end, I took what I learned seriously. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and I never ventured into isolated places alone without proper preparation and backup. The experience left me wary but wiser. I had escaped a potentially dangerous situation with nothing more than fear, vigilance, and quick thinking. I returned to the city, grateful for the normalcy, the noise, the people, and the sense of safety that I had once longed to escape. I still think about the cabin sometimes, the deep forest, the feeling of being watched, but I also think about my choices, the moments of awareness that kept me alive, and the clarity that came from surviving a situation that could have ended much worse. The experience changed me. I learned to respect the isolation of nature, but also to respect the unpredictability of people. And above all, I learned that survival often comes down to attention, caution, and the willingness to act quickly when instinct screams that something is wrong. The forest remains beautiful in my memory, but now it carries a cautionary edge, and I will never forget the sound of footsteps in the dark, the feeling of being observed, and the relief of finally reaching safety. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple: leave the city behind, escape to the woods, and spend a week alone in a cabin I had rented on the outskirts of a national forest. I needed the isolation, a way to disconnect from work, noise, and people, even if just for a few days. I packed carefully: food for a week, water, a first aid kit, extra blankets, a small wood stove, and some basic tools. I double-checked the map and directions, making sure I knew exactly how to reach the cabin, which was deep in a part of the forest where cell phone reception was almost non-existent. That was part of the appeal. The drive itself was long, winding through stretches of road flanked by dense trees, their shadows growing longer as the sun started to set. By the time I arrived, the sky was a soft orange fading into pink, and the forest felt alive in a way that made my skin tingle, not with fear, but with anticipation. The cabin was small, older than I had expected from the photos online, with a weathered wooden exterior, a steep roof, and a narrow porch that creaked when I stepped onto it. The door opened smoothly despite its age, and the inside smelled of wood, dust, and something faintly earthy, like leaves and soil had seeped through the floorboards. The interior was simple: a small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table and 2 chairs, a bedroom with a single bed, and a tiny bathroom. There was no electricity except for a couple of battery-powered lamps and a propane heater. I unpacked quickly, stacking my supplies neatly in the kitchen and setting the blankets on the bed. Outside, the sun disappeared completely, leaving the forest bathed in a dark, heavy blue. I lit a small fire in the stove, feeling the heat fill the room and the orange glow reflect off the walls. At first, the isolation was comforting. I watched the trees sway outside the windows, listened to the wind in the branches, and even heard the occasional distant call of a bird or animal. But as the evening deepened, the sounds of the forest became sharper, more precise. A branch snapping under weight somewhere in the darkness made me pause. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon. That seemed reasonable. The thought helped at first, but the sound repeated, sometimes soft, sometimes louder, sometimes closer, and soon I realized it wasn't just animals moving. Something was shifting around the cabin perimeter, careful, deliberate, almost watching. I told myself it was my imagination. It had to be. There was no one else for miles. The forest was sparsely inhabited. There wasn't a neighbor within a 10-mile radius. Yet, despite knowing that, unease started creeping in. The air felt heavier, colder, even though the wood stove kept the cabin warm. Shadows moved differently than they should have, and sometimes, when I turned toward the window quickly, I thought I saw a shape retreating into the trees. I spent the next day exploring the nearby area, trying to reassure myself. The trail behind the cabin was overgrown but passable, winding through thick underbrush and clusters of pines. I marked a few landmarks with ribbons from my pack, partly to ensure I could find my way back and partly to occupy myself. Everything seemed normal during the daylight. Birds chirped, squirrels scurried up the trees, and the forest floor was littered with fallen leaves and pine needles. But the closer evening came, the more I felt watched. By nightfall, the sense of being observed was unbearable. Every shadow outside the window seemed like it belonged to someone or something else. That night, I slept lightly, the small lamp casting long, moving shadows across the room as the fire flickered. I woke several times, hearing sounds that made my heart pound. A faint scraping on the porch, a thump against the side of the cabin, a rustling in the underbrush that never approached but never fully receded either. I kept the door locked, of course, but I could hear the occasional creak of the wood under some kind of weight. I tried to tell myself the wind was causing it, that branches or debris had fallen against the cabin, but the timing of the noises felt deliberate. By the third day, I realized I had underestimated how isolated and vulnerable I truly was. I had gone in thinking this would be a peaceful retreat, and now the forest felt oppressive. The trees, the wind, the very air seemed hostile. I stopped exploring and stayed inside, focusing on chores. Stacking wood, cleaning, cooking. Still, the noises didn't stop. On that day, I noticed something new. Prints outside the cabin. They were large, muddy, not human, and they circled the cabin in a pattern that suggested someone or something had been watching for hours. I followed the prints to the edge of the tree line and realized they disappeared suddenly, as though whoever made them had simply vanished. Panic started to gnaw at me, a creeping, cold panic that made every sound unbearable. I considered leaving immediately, but the nearest road was several miles away, and the path back was uneven, unmarked in some places, and potentially dangerous if someone or something was following me. I stocked my pack with essentials and tried to plan an early morning departure. I slept little that night, listening intently for movement outside, clutching a sturdy branch I had sharpened as a makeshift weapon. On the fourth day, the sense of danger escalated. I found signs that someone had been inside the cabin while I slept. Small disturbances on the table, a thin smear of mud near the door, faint scratches on the window frames. It was subtle enough that someone without careful eyes might miss it, but I noticed immediately. I realized I could no longer dismiss the signs as animals. This was human. Someone had been watching, tracking me, possibly planning to return. Fear became a tangible thing. I fortified the cabin as best I could. I moved furniture to block the doors, set up a perimeter of noise-making traps with cans and strings around the porch, and kept my pack ready at all times. Every time the wind shifted, I thought it carried footsteps. Every small noise made me flinch. I ate sparingly, drank water cautiously, and slept in short bursts with one eye open. The forest that had seemed so tranquil was now a labyrinth of threats, shadows, and sounds masking danger. By the fifth day, I noticed a figure outside during the early morning light. They stayed just beyond the tree line, half hidden still. I couldn't see clearly, but the posture, the slow, patient stillness, was unmistakably human. I retreated into the cabin, holding my breath, avoiding the windows. The figure stayed there for hours, and then, as the sun rose higher, vanished as quietly as they had appeared. That night, I made the decision to leave immediately. I couldn't wait any longer. I packed all my supplies, took the most essential items, and kept my makeshift weapon close. The forest at night was pitch black, more oppressive than before. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every breeze across the trees felt like pursuit. I forced myself to move, counting each step, staying low, avoiding open areas. The path back to the main road was longer than I remembered. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but the need to escape pushed me forward. At one point, I stumbled into a shallow ditch, scraping my arm and leg on branches. I froze for a moment, fearing someone had seen me. I listened carefully, nothing. I forced myself to get up, ignoring the sting of blood, and continued. Hours passed. My sense of time was warped by exhaustion and fear. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement behind me, fleeting shadows that could have been trees, or perhaps not. Finally, just as dawn began to break, I reached the edge of the forest where the road became visible. I ran into the clearing, gasping for air, and when I reached my car, relief hit me so suddenly that I almost collapsed. The keys were in the ignition, the doors locked, and the engine roared to life as I fumbled to get in. I didn't look back. I drove straight to the nearest town, adrenaline propelling me past exhaustion, stopping only at a gas station to call the local authorities and report what had happened. The officers took the report seriously. They searched the cabin the next day and found evidence that someone had indeed been living in the woods near the cabin. Makeshift campsites, tools, and evidence of someone observing the cabin were scattered in the trees. I learned later that the area was known for transient individuals who sometimes followed tourists for weeks, learning their patterns. That knowledge didn't erase the fear, but it explained the unrelenting sense of being watched, the prints, the intrusions. I never returned to the cabin, and I never spent time alone in such isolation again. The experience stayed with me, a constant reminder of how quickly peace can turn into vigilance, how easily the world outside the safety of walls can become a trap. I learned to respect the forest, its silence, and its hidden inhabitants, not as fairy tale ghosts, but as real, living threats that require caution, preparation, and constant awareness. I remember the day I left for the cabin in the mountains, as if it were a quiet dream I've been replaying over and over, each detail etched in my mind. I had been living in the city for years, the concrete and noise wearing me down, and I needed something that felt distant, removed, far from the blur of cars and endless chatter. The cabin was something I had found online, a small rental nestled deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, with no cell service and a single dirt road leading to it. The idea of being cut off, alone with my thoughts and the endless forest, had been alluring. I packed carefully, choosing supplies I thought I would need. Canned food, a large water jug, a gas stove, a lantern, blankets, and extra batteries. I took my backpacking gear and my journal, thinking I would use the time to write, to think, to exist without distraction. The drive there had taken hours, winding roads narrowing as I left the highways behind. The air had changed as I climbed the mountains, the scent of pine and wet earth replacing the smog and exhaust of the city. By the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was dipping low, golden streaks slicing through the dense forest. The cabin itself was modest, wooden walls weathered by years of wind and rain, a small porch with a creaking railing, and windows that reflected the surrounding trees like dark mirrors. There was a single chimney, though I couldn't tell if the fireplace had been used recently. The place had a certain charm, a quiet isolation that both comforted and unnerved me. I unpacked quickly, trying to set up my temporary home before darkness settled fully. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and old pine, and dust motes floated in the beams of my lantern. The space was small, just a single room with a loft, a kitchenette, and a crude bathroom. The bed was thin, but it would do. I organized my supplies, filled the water jug, and made sure the stove worked. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and a crow cawed somewhere in the distance, its voice sharp and solitary. The first night was uneasy. I went to sleep early, but the forest outside was alive with sounds that I wasn't used to. Rustling leaves, branches snapping, the faint calls of animals moving through the undergrowth. My mind kept imagining shapes, shadows shifting near the edges of the cabin, but I told myself it was nothing, just the play of moonlight and trees. I drifted off eventually, though sleep was light and fragmented, each noise pulling me awake. Morning brought a quiet calm. Sunlight filtered through the trees, painting the cabin interior in warm streaks. I made coffee over the gas stove and ate a simple breakfast of canned beans and bread. I spent the day exploring the small clearing around the cabin, noticing details I had missed in the evening. Footprints of deer pressed into the soft dirt, a small stream running nearby, birds that moved quickly through the branches. The isolation felt peaceful in the daylight, manageable. I told myself I could handle being alone for days. The second day brought a subtle shift. While walking near the stream, I noticed signs that someone else had been in the area recently. A discarded water bottle, a small fire pit that looked freshly used, footprints that didn't match any animal I knew. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was unsettling. I returned to the cabin more alert, checking the doors and windows, even though they were locked and latched. That night, the sounds of the forest felt different, closer, more deliberate. Leaves rustled in ways that suggested weight, not just wind. My sleep was shallow, the hairs on my neck prickling at every sound. On the third day, I began noticing more signs outside. A path of broken twigs led from the tree line toward the cabin, and I found more trash, small items that looked out of place in such a remote location. I started keeping the lantern close even in the daytime and the small knife in my pocket. I tried to rationalize everything. People hike these trails, hunters come through, maybe someone had passed by and forgotten things. Still, a sense of being watched had settled over me, a quiet tension that pressed down like the humidity before a storm. That evening, the wind picked up, carrying with it a sharp chill. I sat inside the cabin, trying to focus on writing in my journal, but my eyes kept flicking to the windows, watching for movement. I heard the crack of a branch outside, and my stomach tightened. I held my breath, listening, but nothing followed. After an hour, I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I set my knife on the table and double-checked the locks before going to sleep. That night, I was awakened by the sound of footsteps crunching in the dirt outside. Slow, deliberate. Someone was walking around the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, heart hammering, watching the shadows shift as the wind rattled the windows. The footsteps moved away eventually, and I lay awake until the first light of dawn. The fourth day, I decided to explore further from the cabin, needing to reassure myself that the forest was empty and that whatever had been there before was gone. I followed a narrow trail that led uphill, climbing rocks and pushing through underbrush. The air smelled damp, earthy, and wild. From the top of the hill, I could see the cabin tucked into the trees below, a small square of isolation. I scanned the surrounding forest, looking for signs of movement. Everything seemed quiet, still. Relief washed over me, but the feeling didn't last. When I returned to the cabin, I found the front door ajar, even though I had locked it that morning. My heart jumped, and I gripped the knife as I stepped inside. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the sense of intrusion lingered. I checked every corner, every cupboard, every drawer. Someone had been here, and it wasn't a passing hiker. I spent the rest of that day barricading the cabin as best I could, moving furniture against doors and windows, stacking firewood near the entrances, and placing knives and tools in easy reach. The forest outside felt oppressive, the shadows stretching long and dark in the late afternoon sun. When night fell, I kept the lantern close and waited, listening. Around midnight, I heard the sound of someone, or something, tapping on the roof. Slow, measured, deliberate. I froze, then pressed myself against the far wall, listening. The tapping stopped after a few minutes, but my hands shook for hours. Sleep was impossible. Over the next 2 days, the tension escalated. Each time I stepped outside, I noticed more signs that someone had been near the cabin. Footprints pressed into the mud, discarded scraps of food, a line of small stones arranged in the dirt that hadn't been there before. I began to realize that whoever was doing this wasn't just passing through. They were watching, studying, waiting. I kept my movements quiet, avoided making noise, and spent most of my time inside, keeping the knife close. By the 5th night, I was nearly at my breaking point. The fear was constant, gnawing at my mind, keeping me alert but exhausted. Around midnight, I heard a faint scratching at the back door. My first instinct was to scream, but I stayed silent, gripping the knife. The scratching continued, slow and steady, deliberate. I could hear the faint rustle of clothing or movement, and my mind raced with scenarios, none of them good. I remembered the old gas stove and decided to take a risk. I lit a small fire in the fireplace, hoping the light would illuminate the room if someone tried to enter. It worked. The glow from the fire threw shadows across the walls, and I saw movement at the window. A figure crouched, trying to remain unseen. I could make out the outline of a person, but the firelight revealed enough to know they were real and close. My heart pounded. I grabbed my backpack, filled it with essentials, and prepared to leave the cabin. The dirt road that led down the mountain was a long way, but I had no choice. Staying meant risking being trapped with someone who had been silently stalking me for days. I waited until the figure retreated, then slipped out the back door, staying low and moving as quietly as I could. I kept the flashlight off, relying on the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. The forest seemed endless, and I moved with adrenaline and fear pushing me forward. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me flinch, but I kept going, focusing on the dirt road below. When I finally reached the road, I ran until I could see headlights approaching. A lone car appeared, and I flagged it down, breathless and terrified. The driver stopped, helped me into the vehicle, and drove me to the nearest town. It was hours before I felt safe enough to rest, but the relief was immense. The isolation of the cabin had been a mistake, a dangerous miscalculation. I reported the intrusion to the authorities, who later confirmed that a transient individual had been living in the forest nearby, watching the cabin, waiting for someone to be alone. The person was eventually apprehended, but I never went back to the cabin. Even months later, I still think about that place. The way the forest felt alive with someone else's presence, the quiet menace that hung in the air, the way fear can twist the mind and body. The experience changed me. I realized that isolation is not always peaceful, that nature can be both beautiful and threatening, and that being alone doesn't always mean being safe. The memory lingers, a reminder of how quickly a simple escape into the wilderness can turn into a fight for survival, and how vigilance and preparation can make the difference between being trapped and finding a way out. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A week alone in a cabin deep in the woods, somewhere far from any roads, where I could forget the city, forget people, and just exist in silence. The cabin was small, old, and wooden, perched on a slight rise overlooking a narrow, slow-moving river. The map the owner had sent me was crude, barely a sketch, but I had been confident in my ability to find it. I packed lightly, enough food for a week, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and plenty of water, along with a first aid kit and a hunting knife. I had told no one where I was going. Part of the appeal was being completely isolated. The first day went smoothly. The hike from the nearest trailhead was longer and steeper than I expected. The woods were thick, the underbrush sharp against my legs, and the trail overgrown in places. I had to push branches aside, step over fallen logs, and occasionally climb a small hill to keep the river in sight as my guide. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was low, and a golden haze filtered through the trees. The structure was more weathered than the pictures suggested. The wood was dark and uneven, the windows dusty and grimy, but the roof was intact, and the door, though heavy, swung open without protest. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and old smoke. There was a simple table, a couple of chairs, a stone fireplace, and a narrow bed. A small stack of firewood sat in the corner. I set my bag down and took a long look out the window at the river, its water glinting as the last light of day faded. The first night was quiet, almost eerily so. The woods were alive with the sounds of birds settling in for the night, the occasional snap of a twig, distant calls of animals I couldn't identify. I made a small fire in the fireplace and cooked a simple meal of canned beans and bread. As I ate, I could hear the wind move through the trees, rustling leaves and brushing branches together. I felt peaceful, and I was certain I had made the right decision to come here alone. The isolation was comforting, but the second night brought unease. I woke around 2 a.m. to a sound that made my stomach knot. A sharp, quick scratching at the side of the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a deer or some other small animal, but the scratching persisted. I got out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and checked the perimeter. Nothing. The night was still, the forest silent except for the wind. I went back inside, heart pounding, convincing myself it was a raccoon or some other small creature looking for food. I slept with the knife next to my bed after that. The third day was warmer, and I spent most of it exploring the river. I walked upstream for hours, noting how the trees thickened, how the ground became slippery and uneven. I found a small clearing with wildflowers and a natural spring. The water was crystal clear, cold, and refreshing. I filled my bottles and returned to the cabin late in the afternoon, tired but satisfied with the day. The forest seemed less threatening in the daylight. The third night, however, was worse than the first two. I had just gotten into bed when I heard it again, a persistent scratching, this time accompanied by soft thumps, like something heavy moving against the outer wall. I froze, listening. The scratching moved along the wall, then stopped. Minutes passed. Then I heard it again, closer, as if something was trying to test the door. My mind raced. Bears didn't usually attack cabins, not ones this high up the river, but wolves could be curious. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, but the sound had a rhythm, intentional in a way that made my pulse spike. I spent the night in fragments. Every time I dozed off, I jerked awake at another scratch or thump. Morning could not come soon enough. I didn't sleep well that day, either staying alert as I cleared brush around the cabin, stacking extra firewood against the walls to act as a minor barrier, and checking the perimeter repeatedly. By the fourth night, I began hearing more than just scratching. Faint footsteps crunched in the underbrush, deliberate and slow. At one point, I swore I heard whispering, though I knew no one could be there. I checked my supplies, making sure I could survive a night without leaving the cabin. I barricaded the door with the table and chairs, positioning the firewood in a triangle in front of it. I slept with the knife under my pillow and my jacket over me, ready to put it on if I had to run. That night, the scratching turned into a banging. Something was hitting the cabin walls repeatedly, testing them. I could hear the boards flex slightly under the force. My heart raced, sweat running down my back. I stayed in one spot, trying to make as little noise as possible, hoping it would stop. Hours passed. The noises faded just before dawn. The morning revealed damage to the cabin. One wall had splintered, wood cracked, the scratch marks deep and uneven. I had underestimated whatever was out there. The realization hit me hard. I was not safe in this cabin alone. The isolation I had cherished now felt like a trap. I decided I had to leave, but the trail was treacherous. I spent the next few hours packing my things carefully, checking the map, and plotting a route to the nearest ranger station. I packed everything into my backpack and left the cabin just as the sun rose. I didn't take time to eat or rest. I moved fast, constantly listening for sounds behind me. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees, something tall, large, but when I stopped and looked, nothing was there. My adrenaline pushed me onward. The journey was exhausting. The underbrush snagged at my clothes, the river was difficult to cross in places, and the steep hills drained my energy. I kept reminding myself that I had survived this far and could continue. Hours later, as the sun reached its highest point, I spotted a trail marker, one of the metal signs indicating the main path. Relief flooded through me. I moved faster, nearly breaking into a run. Finally, by late afternoon, I emerged from the forest onto a gravel road. I was dirt-covered, bleeding in small scratches, and completely exhausted, but I was alive. A car passed by and I waved it down. The driver stopped, and I collapsed into the passenger seat, trembling. I explained nothing, just pointed to the woods. The driver nodded, understanding enough, and drove me to the nearest ranger station. At the station, I filed a report. Rangers inspected the cabin later. They found claw marks and deep scratches along the walls, some from a bear, but the pattern suggested the animal had been unusually aggressive, or perhaps multiple animals had been investigating the structure. They said I had been lucky to escape when I did. The cabin was deemed unsafe and closed to the public until repairs could be made and a more thorough inspection completed. In the days after, I stayed in a motel, washing my clothes, cleaning my cuts, and trying to calm my mind. I realized I had underestimated the wilderness. The woods weren't haunted or magical. They were dangerous because they were alive, full of creatures and forces I couldn't control. I had survived through vigilance, preparation, and luck. The memory of those nights, the pounding on the cabin, the unseen presence outside, stayed with me. A constant reminder that nature can be terrifying in ways no storybook can capture. When I finally returned home, I promised myself I would never go that deep into the forest alone again. I still love the woods, still enjoy hiking, but I now respect them in a way I never did before. The cabin, the river, the sound of claws on wood, it all became part of my understanding of survival. I had gone seeking peace and solitude but had found fear, testing my limits, and ultimately, learning that the line between adventure and danger is thinner than most people realize. I had been driving for hours before I even realized how remote I had become. The road had narrowed to nothing more than a cracked ribbon of asphalt, the trees leaning close on either side as if to block me from seeing anything beyond. My car's headlights cut a thin path through the darkness, illuminating patches of fog that clung to the forest floor. It was the kind of night where every shadow looked like it was moving, and every small noise made me flinch. I had decided on a whim to rent a small cabin in the woods for the weekend, thinking I could escape the city, the noise, the constant weight of responsibility that seemed to press down on my chest. What I didn't think about was how utterly alone I would be out here. The cabin was supposed to be simple, just a small wooden structure with running water, electricity, and a heater. I remembered reading the listing carefully. Secluded, peaceful, perfect for a quiet getaway. Pictures had shown a warm-looking place with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a deck overlooking a clearing in the trees. I hadn't been concerned about distance or accessibility. I assumed that as long as I had a car, I could get there. I didn't realize the access road ended halfway up a hill in deep mud and ruts that would trap any vehicle unfamiliar with the terrain. I finally saw the cabin through the fog, a dark silhouette against the deeper black of the forest. It looked smaller in person than it had in the pictures, but I convinced myself that was part of its charm. The air smelled wet and earthy, thick with the scent of pine needles and decaying leaves. I parked as close to the door as I could, and my boots sank slightly into the damp ground when I stepped out. The silence hit me immediately, far heavier than I expected. There were no sounds of cars, no distant hum of civilization, not even the faint whine of insects. It felt like the forest had swallowed everything else in the world. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of old wood and a lingering dampness, but it wasn't unpleasant. Dust motes floated in the weak light from the single overhead bulb. The place looked like it had been left in a hurry. Half-empty cupboards, a few old magazines stacked haphazardly on the table, a blanket draped over a chair that looked like someone had slept in it recently. I told myself it didn't matter. I wasn't here to inspect someone else's life. I was here to escape my own. I dropped my bag on the floor and ran my hands over the counter, feeling the rough wood grain under my fingertips. The cabin was cold, much colder than I expected, but there was a wood stove in the corner, and I found a small stack of firewood in the corner. As I unpacked a few things, the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. I paused, half expecting the noise to stop immediately if I moved, like the forest itself was listening. There was something about the complete lack of sound beyond the wind that made me aware of every creak and groan of the cabin. The floorboards shifted under my weight with a sound so loud in the stillness I nearly jumped. I lit a small fire in the stove and watched the flames dance, the warmth slowly spreading through the room. Night fell fully, bringing with it a darkness so thick it seemed to press against the walls of the cabin itself. I ate a simple meal from the groceries I had brought. Canned beans, bread, some cheese, and then sat by the window, looking out at the shadowy outline of the trees. Somewhere far away, an animal barked, or perhaps it was a howl. I couldn't tell. It echoed for a few seconds and then disappeared, leaving only the wind and the occasional creak of branches brushing against each other. It wasn't long before I began to notice small things. Details that didn't seem right. The doorknob rattled sometimes, though I knew the door was locked. Footsteps creaked on the floor above me, though there was no second story, no loft, no space for anyone to be. I told myself it was the cabin settling, or my imagination. I told myself it was the wind, but the feeling of being watched persisted, growing heavier as the night deepened. Every little sound made me tense. Every shadow seemed to shift slightly when I blinked. I tried to distract myself by reading an old magazine, but the words blurred after a few minutes. I realized I had been holding my breath without noticing it, and only exhaled shakily when the stove's warmth reminded me I was alone. I decided to check the cabin thoroughly to make sure there was no one else inside. I walked from room to room, shining the flashlight across the floor, the ceiling, the corners. I checked the closets, the bathroom, even under the bed. Nothing, just dust, old newspapers, a few empty bottles behind the fridge. And yet, the unease didn't fade. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right outside, that the forest itself was moving in ways I couldn't see. By the time I returned to the living area, the fire had died down to glowing embers. I added another log and sat, staring at the flames, trying to calm myself. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping at the window. Not loud, not urgent, just slow, deliberate. My heart jumped, and I froze, staring at the darkened glass. Outside, The wind still swirled, and the trees seemed to sway in the night, but there was no one there. I walked slowly to the window, every muscle tense, and saw nothing but the reflection of the fire behind me. I exhaled sharply, telling myself it had been a branch or a trick of the light, but I couldn't forget it. The tapping came again, quieter this time, almost hesitant. My stomach knotted. I stayed still, listening, waiting for the sound to repeat, to grow, to confirm my worst fears. But it never did. I sat back down, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. I stayed awake for hours, the fire dying completely, the darkness pressing against the windows. Every small noise, the wind, the distant animal calls, the shifting of the cabin, was magnified, amplified by my fear. At some point, I realized sleep wasn't going to come. I couldn't stop imagining someone outside, watching, waiting. I checked the locks again, all secure. I checked the windows, all secure. I considered leaving, even in the dark, but the road back was treacherous, and my car was parked too far down to reach safely. I had no choice but to wait for dawn. Hours passed. The tapping didn't return, but I began hearing other noises. Scratches at the back door, a slow rustle near the porch, footsteps on the gravel outside. I didn't dare look, didn't dare move. I kept the flashlight close, the firewood stacked, ready to defend myself if I had to. My mind raced with possibilities. An animal, a trespasser, someone who had hidden near the cabin before I arrived. Every scenario was terrifying in its own way. As first light crept through the trees, I felt a strange shift. The sounds had stopped. The forest seemed still. I cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. The air was cold and crisp, sunlight breaking through the fog. I walked slowly around the cabin, inspecting the perimeter. There were no footprints, no disturbances in the gravel or dirt, no sign that anyone had been there. Only the mud, the leaves, and the distant, empty forest. I stayed for another day, never letting myself out of sight of the cabin. Every small noise, every flicker of movement in the trees kept me tense. But eventually, I realized the cabin had been empty, the noises natural, amplified by my isolation and fear. I packed up and left, the morning sun guiding me down the muddy road, feeling both exhausted and relieved. Even after I returned home, I thought about the cabin, about the fear that had consumed me for those long hours. It was the isolation, the unknown, the complete lack of control that had made it so terrifying. And yet, it had been real, tangible. There were no ghosts, no magic, no monsters. Just a place, alone, in the dark, and the very human capacity to imagine danger where none existed. When I look back, I realize it wasn't just the forest that had scared me. It was what solitude can do to a person, how isolation can turn every small sound into a threat, every shadow into a danger. And that realization, strange as it is, feels both terrifying and liberating. I survived, unharmed, but I carry the memory with me. The memory of hours spent in silence, listening to the forest, and feeling more alive than I had in years, simply because I had faced my own mind in its purest, most vulnerable state. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The thought of leaving behind the constant noise of the city, the traffic, the crowds, and even my own relentless routine was intoxicating. I wanted quiet, isolation, a chance to breathe without having to explain anything to anyone. The cabin I had rented was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, perched on the edge of a small clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. The road leading to it had been barely more than a dirt track, and by the time I arrived, my car was coated in dust and small scratches from branches brushing against it. The cabin itself was small, built of old timber that had been weathered by years of wind and rain. It had a sloped roof, a small porch with a creaking wooden railing, and a single chimney that promised warmth if the fire was treated properly. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the air carried the faint mustiness of a place that had been closed up for weeks. There was a kitchen area, a small living room, and a loft bedroom that could only be accessed by a narrow wooden ladder. The windows were small, with heavy curtains that I drew back to let in the weak afternoon sunlight. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, a wall of green and brown that seemed almost impenetrable. The first day passed without incident. I unpacked my things, stacked firewood near the stove, and explored the small clearing around the cabin. There were tracks in the mud, probably from deer or other wildlife, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded me that I was not alone. I felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. I had done this before, stayed in remote cabins, hiked alone, but there was something different about this place. The isolation was heavier, the silence more oppressive. By the time night fell, I was both exhausted and alert, my senses tuned to every sound. The first night I slept poorly. The wind shook the windows, and the occasional snap of a branch against the roof made me startle awake. I kept imagining someone, or something, moving outside, though I knew the nearest road was miles away. By morning, the sun felt like a relief. I made coffee on the small gas stove and sat on the porch, listening to the birds and the rustle of the trees. The world felt slow here, distant from the rest of humanity. Over the next couple of days, I settled into a routine. I chopped firewood, cleaned the cabin, explored the trails around the clearing, and took photographs of the forest. The woods were alive with movement. Squirrels darting between trees, birds swooping through the air, and the distant call of something larger that I couldn't identify. I kept a mental map of the trails, marking landmarks in my mind. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a fear I could rationalize. It wasn't like there were people around, but the hair on the back of my neck would stand up when I moved quietly through the trees. It was on the third day that things began to feel wrong. I had gone for a longer hike, following a narrow trail that led up a hill behind the cabin. The air was damp from an earlier rain, and the ground was slippery. I noticed broken branches, footprints that didn't belong to any animal I recognized, and patches of trampled underbrush that suggested something, or someone, had passed through recently. I tried to convince myself it was a hunter or a hiker, but I knew the area was mostly deserted. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it when I left. My stomach sank. I pushed the door open cautiously and stepped inside. Everything appeared normal, nothing was missing, but there was a subtle shift in the air, a feeling that the space was no longer entirely mine. I checked the windows, the locks, even the small shed behind the cabin. Nothing seemed disturbed. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the forest had played tricks on me. I reinforced the door and windows, made sure my phone was fully charged, and tried to shake the unease. That night, I heard something moving outside. At first, it was subtle. The crunch of leaves, a branch snapping, faint but deliberate. I froze, listening, holding my breath. The sounds were consistent, slow, measured, and they came closer to the cabin. I considered going outside, but the thought of confronting whoever or whatever was there made me hesitate. I grabbed a flashlight and a hatchet, making sure I was ready. The rustling continued for hours, circling the cabin, but I never saw anything through the darkness. Sleep came fitfully, if at all. The next morning, I found evidence that terrified me. Footprints in the soft mud around the cabin were too large to be mine, too human-shaped to be any animal I knew. They circled the cabin several times, pausing at windows, near the doors, and in front of the shed. I felt my chest tighten as I stared at them, realizing that someone had been here in the night, watching me. I packed up a small bag with essentials, food, water, and tools, thinking I might leave, but my car was stuck in the mud at the edge of the clearing. The rain from the previous days had turned the dirt road into a slippery, nearly impassable track. I realized I was trapped, at least temporarily. The following days were tense and exhausting. I stayed inside most of the time, keeping the fire going, reinforcing doors, and checking the perimeter constantly. At night, the sounds returned, moving slowly around the cabin, testing me, probing me. I never saw anyone, but the evidence was undeniable. Footprints, broken branches, disturbed underbrush. The fear was physical, a weight on my chest, a tremor in my hands. I rationed food and water carefully, knowing I might be stuck longer than I expected. On the 5th day, I decided I had to leave. The rain had stopped, and the dirt track might have dried enough for my car. I packed everything quickly, loaded the car, and started the engine. The vehicle struggled in the mud, wheels spinning, but after several tense minutes, I was moving slowly along the track. Then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold, the crunch of leaves and branches behind me. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a figure, distant but clearly human, moving with deliberate steps along the edge of the trees, keeping pace with the car. My heart pounded. I pressed the accelerator harder, ignoring the way the tires slid on the mud. The figure stayed with me, never breaking step, always just at the edge of the forest. I drove as fast as I dared, sliding and fishtailing along the narrow track until I reached a paved road. When I finally emerged into open space, the figure was gone. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, my hands shaking, stomach churning, and body drenched in sweat. I reported the incident to the local authorities, describing the footprints and the figure I had seen, but with no concrete evidence, they could only advise caution. Looking back, I realized how vulnerable I had been. Isolation is a double-edged sword. It gives peace, but it also exposes you to dangers you can't always control or predict. I never returned to that cabin. I researched the area, and I learned that others had reported similar experiences, someone watching from the trees, strange disturbances around cabins, footprints that appeared overnight. The explanation was likely human, hunters, trespassers, people drawn to isolated areas, but knowing that doesn't ease the memory. I've learned to respect isolation differently now. I still seek quiet places, but never without precautions. Checking vehicles, marking trails, setting traps or alarms, and always leaving a plan with someone I trust. The fear I felt in those woods is something I carry with me, a reminder that solitude is not always safe, and that the wilderness, while beautiful, can harbor threats that no amount of preparation can completely eliminate. The experience changed me. I sleep with the lights on now, double-check locks, and my awareness of my surroundings is sharper than it ever was. I tell this story not to scare, but to remind that realism can be far more terrifying than fantasy. The forest was real, the threat was real, and the terror I felt was entirely grounded in the possibilities of human behavior. That clarity, the knowledge that danger can be very close even when unseen, is something I will never forget. I never liked being alone in the woods, but that weekend, I convinced myself it was exactly what I needed. The cabin had been rented months in advance, tucked deep into the mountains where cell service barely existed. I told myself the isolation would be peaceful, a chance to disconnect from the constant noise of life in the city. What I didn't realize then was how quickly peace could turn into something so uncomfortable, something that would make me question every decision that led me there. The drive to the cabin was long and winding. The GPS kept losing signal, forcing me to rely on printed directions I had found online. By the time I reached the last turn, the road was nothing more than a narrow dirt path, lined by dense trees on either side. I remember gripping the steering wheel tightly, watching the shadows of the branches stretch across the windshield in the fading light. The sun had just started to dip behind the peaks, and the air smelled like wet pine and earth. I parked the car in a small clearing next to the cabin, grateful that it was still light enough to see the structure clearly. The cabin itself was small but solid, built of rough-hewn logs with a pitched roof and a stone chimney. It had a front porch that creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it, and a heavy wooden door that required effort to open. Inside, the place smelled faintly of wood smoke and cleaning products, and I could see the faint outline of dust motes in the air. The interior was simple: one main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a staircase that led to a loft with a bed. A single window faced the forest, giving a clear view of the trees just outside. I set down my bags, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. The first night was eerily quiet. I had brought firewood, so I started a small fire in the stove, the crackling flames filling the room with warmth. I ate a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, and then tried to relax, reading a book until my eyelids grew heavy. As darkness fell completely, I noticed the forest outside the window. The shadows of the trees stretched across the clearing in ways that felt unnatural, and every little sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me tense. I told myself it was just the forest settling, just animals moving about. But even then, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I slept poorly, waking often to the sounds of the forest. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, crunching on the gravel path leading to the cabin. I froze, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound had been too deliberate, too heavy. The next morning, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, with thick underbrush and tall pines that blocked most of the sunlight. I noticed faint tire tracks leading away from the clearing, older and partially overgrown, and wondered if someone had been here recently. Despite the unease, I tried to focus on practical tasks: stacking firewood, checking the water supply, and marking the perimeter of the property so I could get my bearings. By mid-afternoon, I had settled into a routine of chopping wood, gathering water from a nearby stream, and keeping the cabin in order. It was mundane work, but it gave me a sense of control that the isolation threatened to take away. On the third day, the unease returned in a more tangible way. I had gone to the stream to refill my water jugs, and when I returned, I noticed that the back door of the cabin was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. My stomach tightened as I walked cautiously inside, checking every corner. Nothing appeared to be missing, and there were no obvious signs of entry, but the thought that someone could have been inside while I was gone made my skin crawl. I double-checked all the locks and reinforced them with a makeshift wooden brace I fashioned from a spare plank. That evening, I decided to keep the fire burning longer than usual, using it as a point of comfort. The shadows in the cabin seemed longer, stretching across the walls and ceiling in unnatural ways, and I caught myself jumping at every sound outside. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard the faint echo of footsteps on the dirt road leading to the cabin. I kept reminding myself that I was in a remote area, that it was probably just the wind or wildlife, but the nagging sense of being watched refused to leave. The following morning, I woke to a far more alarming discovery. The supply of canned goods I had brought in, neatly stacked in the kitchen, had been disturbed. Some cans were knocked over, and a few were missing entirely. Panic surged through me. I had been careful, leaving no signs of food outside the cabin that could attract animals. I inspected the windows and doors again. Everything was locked, but the fact remained. Someone had been inside. I felt a mixture of fear and anger. Whoever had entered my cabin had violated the one place I thought was safe. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin even more. I piled extra logs against the doors and windows, set up a makeshift alarm using cans and string, and kept a large kitchen knife at my side. I tried to rationalize what was happening. Perhaps someone from a nearby property had been scavenging. Perhaps it was a hunter who had wandered too close. But the thought that it could have been something more deliberate made my stomach twist. As the sun began to set, I decided to stay in the loft for the night, keeping the knife within arm's reach. The wind picked up, rattling the window panes and sending branches scratching against the exterior walls. Every small sound seemed amplified in the silence of the forest. Around midnight, I thought I heard movement outside, not the casual sounds of animals, but deliberate, slow steps circling the cabin. I didn't move, barely breathing, listening as the sounds came closer and then receded. It felt like hours before the footsteps finally disappeared. The next morning, I left the cabin cautiously to check the perimeter. The forest floor was soft with fallen needles, and I saw distinct footprints around the cabin that hadn't been there before. They were large, heavy, and not animal prints. My pulse raced as I traced them in the dirt, realizing that whoever had been there the night before had been surveying the cabin, waiting for me to sleep. I returned inside and decided that I couldn't stay any longer without risking further intrusion. I packed my essentials into my backpack, leaving food and supplies behind, knowing that they could be replaced. I drove down the dirt road as fast as I dared, constantly glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. The trees thinned, the gravel gave way to paved roads, and eventually, I reached an area with cell service. I called the local authorities and reported the trespassing. They promised to send a ranger to check the cabin, but I knew that, realistically, whoever had been there might already be long gone. The sense of relief as I drove away was overwhelming, but the memory of the footprints, the footsteps, and the feeling of being watched stayed with me for weeks afterward. Back in the city, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I told myself that I had been lucky, that it could have been far worse, and that I had learned a valuable lesson about isolation in remote areas. The cabin was no longer a place of retreat for me. It had become a symbol of vulnerability. Even months later, I couldn't help but imagine someone, somewhere, walking quietly through the trees, watching, waiting for the right moment. Eventually, I came to terms with it. I realized that fear is not always a product of imagination. Sometimes it is a rational response to real danger. I began taking precautions whenever I ventured into remote areas, always letting someone know my plans, checking in frequently, and carrying tools and alarms for protection. The experience at the cabin was a stark reminder that solitude in the wilderness can be deceptive. The forest may seem serene, but behind the calm is a world that is indifferent to our presence, and sometimes it holds people who do not share that indifference. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. The idea of leaving the city behind, the noise, the crowds, and the endless obligations had been growing in my mind like a quiet hunger. I wanted silence, isolation, and the simple feeling of being surrounded by nature. I had chosen a cabin deep in the mountains, miles away from any main road, accessible only by a rough dirt track that twisted through dense forests and past steep cliffs. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from heavy logs and with a metal roof that had weathered many winters. The last few miles of the drive had been nerve-wracking. The path was narrow, littered with rocks and fallen branches, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine. My car had grumbled up the last incline, leaving me at the small clearing where the cabin stood, and the sense of isolation hit me all at once. I parked, shut off the engine, and listened. The only sounds were the wind brushing through the trees, a distant bird call, and the faint rustle of something moving unseen in the underbrush. The cabin was simple inside. A single room with a small kitchen corner, a wood-burning stove, and a table that had scratches and stains from decades of use. A single bed with a threadbare mattress and a thick blanket rested against the wall, and shelves with old books and some jars of supplies lined the remaining space. I had brought my own supplies too: canned food, water, a first aid kit, batteries, and a lantern, but the cabin was stocked enough for a short stay. My plan had been to stay 3 days, to hike the surrounding trails, fish in the nearby stream, and just let the isolation work its quiet magic on me. The first night passed without incident. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, listened to the wind, and fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the drive and the hike I had taken after unloading my things. When I woke the next morning, the air was cold but clean, and the sunlight slanted through the tall pines in sharp beams. I prepared breakfast, then packed a small backpack for a hike along the ridge I had spotted from the cabin. The trail was barely visible, overgrown in places, but I followed it carefully. The forest was thick, the trees close together, and the ground was uneven with roots and stones. I stayed aware of every sound: the snap of a branch underfoot, the distant calls of birds, the rustle of leaves. By late morning, I had reached a high point where the valley spread out below me, green and deep, with the river winding like a silver thread. I rested there, taking photos and drinking water, feeling completely removed from the world I had left behind. I was returning to the cabin by mid-afternoon when I first noticed that something was off. A small, subtle thing at first. I thought I had seen movement out of the corner of my eye. Shapes among the trees, too big to be birds, too quiet to be squirrels. I shrugged it off, telling myself that the forest was full of deer and other animals. and that my nerves were probably heightened by the isolation. The sun was beginning to dip, and I wanted to be back before it got dark. The trail was harder going than I remembered, and the forest seemed to close in around me as I descended. When I finally saw the cabin clearing ahead, relief washed over me. The familiar lines of the cabin, the smell of wood and earth, the small path leading up to the door. It was a sight I had craved. That night, though, was different. I had a simple dinner and lit the lantern, placing it on the table so its light would fill the small space. I worked through a book I had brought, but every few minutes, I thought I heard noises from outside. Soft, almost imperceptible steps crunching through the leaves, distant but deliberate. I kept telling myself it was nothing, deer, maybe a fox, but the sound didn't fit the patterns of normal animals. It was too rhythmic, too cautious. I checked the windows, shining my flashlight across the clearing. Nothing. The moon had risen, casting pale silver light over the cabin, and I felt a chill, not from the cold but from awareness, a sense of being watched. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay in the bed, blanket pulled tightly, listening to the forest. The noises outside did not go away. Occasionally, a branch would snap closer than I could imagine any animal stepping, and my heart would leap into my throat. I tried to convince myself that it was normal, that animals wandered near cabins at night, that the wind carried sounds in strange ways. But I could not ignore the feeling that something was lingering in the shadows just beyond the trees. The next morning, I decided I needed to investigate. I dressed warmly, grabbed a small hatchet and a flashlight, and stepped outside. The sun was low but rising, and the forest looked inviting and calm, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped me the night before. I walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter, scanning for any signs of animals or intruders. I found nothing unusual, no tracks, no broken branches, no scat. But as I walked further along the narrow path leading into the woods, I saw it. Footprints. They were large, human-shaped, partially obscured by fallen leaves and dirt, but unmistakably human. They led from the edge of the trees toward the cabin and then back into the forest. My stomach sank. I had been completely alone, yet someone had been here during the night. I spent the rest of the morning preparing for the worst. I gathered more firewood, secured the windows and doors as best I could, and packed supplies in case I had to leave quickly. I moved quietly, alert to every sound. By afternoon, I had convinced myself to stay, reasoning that whoever had been there likely would not return, or perhaps had just been a transient traveler or hiker. I hiked again, this time to a small stream I had found the day before. The water was cold and clear, and I filled my bottle, trying to calm myself. The hike helped. It reminded me that the forest was vast, that humans were rarely solitary here, and that danger was unlikely if I stayed aware. As evening fell, though, the tension returned. The noises at night had a rhythm now. Scratches near the cabin door, soft footsteps circling it, brief rustlings among the pines that stopped whenever I looked directly at them. I sat at the table, knife in hand, listening and watching. I thought about the reports I had read online. Cabin intrusions, lost hikers who had wandered into the wrong place, desperate people who had broken into remote homes. I knew the cabin had no phone line, no easy way to call for help, and my cell service was spotty at best. Panic crept into my mind, but I tried to channel it into caution rather than fear. I stacked more wood by the stove, kept my backpack ready with essentials, and went to bed with the knife under my pillow, ears straining. That night, I woke to the sound of the door handle rattling. My blood froze. Someone was trying to open the door. I gripped the knife and moved silently to the window, peering into the darkness. A shadow moved just beyond the clearing. My mind raced. Whoever it was, they were testing the door, probably hoping it would be unlocked or that I would leave it unguarded. I stayed still, waiting. After a long, unbearable moment, the shadow receded into the forest. The door handle stopped rattling. I did not sleep again that night. The next morning, I realized I had to leave. I packed quickly but thoroughly, leaving nothing behind that could be useful. The dirt road back to the main highway stretched ahead, but I was tense, alert to every movement. As I drove, I kept the car in low gear, scanning the tree line for any sign of someone following. The forest was quiet, deceptive in its normalcy. My heart was still racing, and it took hours to calm down even after I reached paved roads and civilization again. The experience left me shaken, but in a strange way, it also left me with clarity. I understood the importance of preparation, the unpredictability of human behavior, and the thin line between peace and fear when isolated. I returned home, grateful for my safety, and with a deeper respect for the wilderness and for my own instincts. The cabin itself remained in my memory as a place of quiet beauty, but also as a reminder of vulnerability. I never returned to that particular cabin, but I learned to respect both the solitude and the hidden dangers of remote places. In the following weeks, I told close friends about what had happened, careful to avoid exaggeration. I reviewed my preparations, noted every lesson learned, and began to understand that fear, when managed properly, could sharpen awareness rather than paralyze it. Months later, when I went hiking again, I carried more safety gear, planned exits carefully, and maintained a constant awareness of my surroundings. The forest had not changed. It was still beautiful, still inviting, still dangerous if one was careless. But I had changed. I had faced a real fear, learned from it, and emerged with both caution and confidence. The cabin, the forest, the quiet nights, they had tested me, and I had survived. That trip stayed with me, not as a tale of terror, but as a profound lesson in vigilance, preparation, and respect for the wilderness. I never doubted my decision to go, but I understood now that solitude could hide not only peace, but danger. And I carried that understanding with me forever, knowing that the moments of fear had also sharpened my ability to survive, to notice, and to act when necessary. The cabin remained a symbol in my mind, not of ghosts or fairy tales, but of real human vulnerability and the thin, delicate line between safety and danger in the wild. I had been planning this trip for months, telling myself that I needed a break from the constant noise of the city, from the endless buzzing of phones, emails, and obligations. I wanted silence, a real kind of silence, the kind that only comes when there is nothing else around you but trees, wind, and the occasional bird call. The cabin I rented was deep in the woods, far from the main road, off a gravel track that wound through dense pine and birch. The photos online made it look cozy, a wooden structure with large windows, a stone fireplace, and a small deck that overlooked a narrow creek. I imagined myself reading by the fire, walking through the forest with a thermos of coffee, and sleeping to the rhythm of nature. The drive up was longer than I expected. The road narrowed, the asphalt giving way to packed dirt, then loose gravel. My old car bounced over ruts and rocks, the tires crunching loudly. As I went deeper, the forest thickened, and the tall pines blocked the sun, casting long, dark shadows across the road. I noticed the air changing too, cooler and damp, smelling of wet earth and pine needles. Birds flew overhead, squawking, and somewhere a woodpecker drummed against a tree. There were no other cars, no houses, nothing but the forest. At first, it felt peaceful. Then, after the fifth hairpin turn, it began to feel isolating. When I finally reached the cabin, I had to stop the car at the end of a narrow path. The cabin stood alone, surrounded by thick trees. The wooden walls were dark, dampened by the morning mist, and the windows were slightly fogged. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and walked up the steps to the small porch. The front door was solid wood with a heavy metal handle. I unlocked it and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of old wood, musty but not unpleasant. Dust motes floated in the streams of light coming through the windows. The living area was larger than I expected, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. A couch sat facing it, worn but clean. The kitchen was small, a sink, a stove, a counter, and a few cabinets stocked with basic utensils. A narrow hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. I dropped my bag and began unpacking slowly, trying to settle in. I spent the morning exploring the cabin, checking the windows, the locks, making sure everything was secure. The first few hours were calming. I unpacked my things, made some coffee, and sat on the deck watching the creek trickle over mossy stones. There was a gentle breeze, and the sun occasionally broke through the canopy, creating patches of light on the forest floor. I could hear the rustling of animals, squirrels chattering, maybe a deer moving through the trees. I felt a strange sense of detachment from the rest of the world, a kind of relief in knowing I was completely alone. By late afternoon, the sun was low, filtering through the trees at sharp angles. I decided to go for a short walk to stretch my legs. The forest was quiet, the only sounds my own footsteps and the occasional bird call. I followed a small trail that led down to the creek, stepping over fallen logs and slippery roots. The water was clear, running over smooth stones. I knelt down, letting the cold water run over my fingers. I looked around and saw no other people, no cabins, nothing but trees stretching endlessly. I returned to the cabin before sunset. I decided to start a fire in the fireplace. The logs were damp at first, smoked heavily, but soon they caught, and a warm glow filled the room. I sat on the couch, watching the flames, sipping coffee, feeling the warmth seep into my muscles. As night fell, the forest grew darker. The shadows of the trees stretched long and strange across the cabin walls. The sounds changed. The wind rustled the trees, making them creak and groan. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal, probably a deer. But still, a subtle unease began to creep in. I went to bed early, the cabin cold once the fire burned down. I lay under heavy blankets, listening to the wind and the occasional rustle outside. Sleep came slowly. Every small noise seemed louder in the quiet. I woke several times to branches scraping against the walls or the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was all normal forest sounds, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I decided to explore further. I packed a small backpack with water, snacks, a flashlight, and a pocket knife, more out of habit than necessity. I followed another trail I had noticed yesterday, winding deeper into the woods. The trees grew closer together, the light dimmer. I crossed over fallen logs and small streams, carefully watching my step. After about an hour, I noticed signs of recent human activity. Footprints, tire tracks, and discarded plastic wrappers. It was unsettling because there was no road nearby, no way for someone to have come here easily. I continued walking, but my unease grew. Every sound seemed amplified. Twigs snapping underfoot, leaves rustling in the wind, distant calls of birds. I reached a small clearing where I stopped to catch my breath and drink water. As I looked around, I noticed the footprints forming a rough circle around the clearing, as if someone had walked in a pattern repeatedly. I felt a tightness in my chest. I couldn't see anyone, but the signs were unmistakable. I hurried back to the cabin, my senses heightened. When I reached it, the door looked the same, but my mind was racing. I checked the locks, examined the windows, even the back door. Everything was secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here, watching, waiting. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was imagining things, that the forest made the mind play tricks. I decided to stay inside for the rest of the day. The night was worse. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin. Every branch that fell sounded like it hit the walls. I sat by the dying fire, flashlight in hand, scanning the windows, every shadow making my pulse spike. At one point, I thought I saw movement out the corner of my eye. I froze, listening, but heard nothing but the wind. I told myself it was a deer or some other animal, but the unease remained. The following morning, I realized I needed to get out, to leave before my fear made me act irrationally. But when I went to start my car, I noticed tire tracks leading to the cabin that weren't there before, tracks that looked fresh. My heart sank. I had locked the cabin when I went for my walk yesterday, and now these tracks led directly from the forest to my car. Panic gripped me. I grabbed my backpack, threw my bag in the back seat, and considered my options. The main road was several miles away, and there was no cell reception here. I decided to take a different trail back, one that might connect to the gravel road I had driven in on. I kept my senses alert, moving quickly but carefully. Branches snapped behind me. Shadows seemed to shift. I kept imagining footsteps, glimpses of someone moving among the trees. I told myself repeatedly that I was being paranoid, that the forest made ordinary sounds seem sinister. Still, the tension in my chest refused to ease. By late afternoon, I reached the gravel road. Relief washed over me. I walked along it until I saw my car in the distance. But as I approached, I froze. The back window was smashed, glass scattered across the ground. My backpack was open, its contents strewn. There were deep scratches on the trunk, and the rear tires were slashed. My stomach churned. I checked quickly, my hands trembling, and realized everything I needed for the drive back. My wallet, keys, phone was still inside, untouched. Whoever had been here must have been watching me carefully, waiting for the moment I returned. I got into the car, started it, and drove slowly, every shadow along the road making me flinch. I didn't take the shortest path back. I drove through different forest roads, occasionally stopping to catch my breath and calm my nerves. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following, but the roads were empty. Hours later, I finally reached the main highway. The lights of passing cars felt like a blessing. Civilization, finally. I pulled over at a gas station, trembling, and called the police to report what had happened. They took my statement seriously but couldn't send anyone into the forest immediately. I returned home that night, exhausted and shaken, grateful to have left the cabin and the woods behind. In the days that followed, I realized just how lucky I had been. The person or people who had been at the cabin could have caused serious harm. They had watched me, had been able to strike at any moment. I replaced the locks on my apartment, installed cameras, and started taking basic safety precautions more seriously than ever. I never returned to that cabin, never even considered it. And although the memories of the forest, the isolation, and the tracks remain vivid, they also serve as a harsh reminder of how vulnerable we can be when we think we are alone. Over time, the fear subsided, replaced by a cautious respect for the wilderness and the unpredictability of other humans. I still love the idea of solitude in nature, but now I approach it with careful planning, awareness, and the knowledge that the real danger often comes not from shadows or imagination, but from the presence of others, silent, unseen, and watching. And even now, whenever I pass a stretch of forest road or see a remote cabin, I remember that cabin. The smells of old wood and damp earth, the creaking trees, the footprints in the dirt, and I shiver. Not from ghosts or stories, but from the very real knowledge that fear can grow in total silence, and that sometimes the most terrifying presence is not something supernatural, but someone who is very much real.